Another important Germanic tribe, now to get back to the German tribes, were the Vandals. They too had begun in what's now known as Germany, but ended up in North Africa around the time period we're talking about. And so we're throughout North Africa except for Egypt. Many of the Vandals were Arians. They had been converted by Arian missionaries, ultimately ended up persecuting the Orthodox, both those that were Catholic as well as the Donatists. And so, although the Donatists had found some common cause with the Vandals for a while, eventually that began to deteriorate. They too would eventually sack Rome, this time in the year 455. At that time, Leo is also called upon to go out and try to negotiate with the Vandals. This time, however, he is not successful. He does manage to keep the Vandal leader from burning the city down, but the Vandals do take it over. Now, with the Vandal invasion of Rome, that destabilized the government even further. And so, essentially, secular government was broken down. And Leo steps into this and gains political power because a lot of the functions that were usually related to the civil government, he was now taking on, and the church was now taking on. North Africa and the Vandals would eventually be conquered by the Byzantines in the year 534. I mentioned that when the Goths migrated, some of those stayed in the east. Those eastern Goths were known as the Ostrogoths. They too were Arian. I'm sure you're noticing a pattern here. If you're not pagan, you're Arian. If you're a barbarian invader. They too were interested in what is now Italy, especially after the Huns left. Right? So as the Huns begin their retreat, the Ostrogoths are moving in. The last Roman emperor, as I mentioned, was deposed in 476. And as that emperor is deposed, the Ostrogoths are able to move in, giving them better control of the area. The Nicene Christians who were present in Italy and Rome during this time tried to appeal to specifically Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor, 408, and try and get rid of these Arian invaders. Because of this, the Ostrogoths tended to persecute the Nicene Christians because they looked upon them as being conspiratorial. Right? You're trying to overthrow our government. Eventually, in the 6th century, the armies of the Emperor Justinian would invade Italy and conquer the Ostrogoths. Northern Gaul had been settled by a Germanic tribe known as the Franks. These were not invaders all named Frank. So the Franks had come. These are the group, of course, that will become modern France. And for a while were fairly successful and productive in conquering of Western Europe. They had been involved in helping defeat the Huns, but they were pagans. By the time of the late 4th century, early 5th century, several of the Frankish tribes had been brought together by a man named Clovis. Clovis had married a Catholic, who was actually a princess of another tribe that we're not going to talk about known as the Burgundians. And so there's kind of a political maneuvering here. And so they get married, but shortly after their son is baptized, he dies. Some say that even while he was still in his baptismal clothes. And so shortly, right after baptism. And Clovis's response, essentially, to all this is that his gods would not have allowed this to happen. And so it's kind of an indication that the Christian God is not very powerful. But when he is in battle with another tribe later on, he decides to pray to the Christian God and ends up being successful in that battle. So he decides to be baptized. According to a Frankish historian, when Clovis was baptized, so were 3,000 of his soldiers, which has led this event being made known as the Frankish Pentecost, and this idea of 3,000 people being baptized. The succession of Frankish kings, starting with Clovis, is known as the Merovingian dynasty. It appears, though, that Clovis's character really doesn't change much after his baptism. There isn't that true conversion. It's simply he's adopted a Christian identity. But after his baptism, he, of course, is anointed with oil. And so after this point, many of the Merovingian kings are anointed as a sign of the recognition of their ruling being divinely ordained. Now, because of this, it also led the Merovingian kings to believe that they had also authority over the church, that the bishops should obey the rulers. And so the kings in this dynasty would make decisions regarding who's going to be new bishop when there were vacancies. On the other hand, in the Merovingian-controlled area, the bishops often acted as local lords. They had control of sizable pieces of land, and so they essentially ruled over these much like a lord would, which led to some Christians complaining that the kingdom had so much power over the church, and the bishops acted like lords instead of shepherds. The Lombards were another one of these tribes moving around at this time. They too were Arians, and a lot of their focus was on taking over Italy, and they did so in the middle of the 6th century. Now remember, the Byzantine Empire had kind of pushed out and took over the Ostrogoths. But eventually, the army passed, there's need of more things back in Constantinople, and so the Byzantine army is not very strong by the middle of the 6th century and falls to the Lombards. With the pulling back of the Byzantine army, it's the Bishop of Rome, it's the church in Rome, that essentially becomes responsible for defending Rome, for preserving the city, for doing a lot of things that civil government would take. The Bishop of Rome, eventually in the late 6th century, offers the Lombards some gold to try and keep them from attacking Rome. Also tries to get help from Constantinople on one side and from the Franks on the other side, but ends up not getting much help from either place. Any questions about any of these tribes? Certainly, this is a very brief overview, but our focus is trying to see how these different types of Christianity are interacting with politics.
Were those tribes types of governments basically a chieftain, or did they have kings that they had basically monarchs?
It kind of depended. Essentially, as they take over Rome, they adopt more of the king type of model. Previously, it does seem to have been chieftains, and then also we'll talk on Thursday about Great Britain and Ireland, and a lot of those were more chieftains. But eventually, a lot of these adopted the king type of model. Any other questions about the tribes? In the latter part of the 7th century, so the late 600s, the Merovingian dynasty had largely weakened. There were still kings at this time, but those kings were largely figureheads. And the real power was in a variety of chamberlains or mayors of the palace. Essentially, these individuals worked like prime ministers, but these were the ones that had the true power while the kings were losing theirs. As we move into the 8th century, one of the most powerful of these chamberlains was a man named Charles Martel, who was also nicknamed the Hammer. As Muslims had spread their political control, we'll talk about Islam here in a little bit, they had taken over Spain and began working their way into what is modern-day France. It was Martel who had defeated them at the Battle of Tours in 732. This gave him a lot of authority, but he never actually takes the title king, even though he's the ruling power. His son, however, Pepin III, also known as Pepin the Short, is able to remove King Childeric III, also known as Childeric the Stupid, and has him removed from power, and Pepin sets himself up as king. Largely, Pepin becoming king is due to the support of the papacy. The popes were helping this because they looked upon the chamberlains as being the true power here. Pepin, though, is also kind of expected to help out Rome as well. As the Lombards are pushing into Italy, the Pope will appeal to Pepin to come help them since the Byzantines are not able to. Gradually, the relationship between the Franks and the popes continued to develop. The Pope no longer is looking for help from the east. They are looking to the west and to the Franks. Pepin dies in the year 768. His sons succeed him, and 2 of his sons actually rule after him, but one of his sons dies, and his other son, Charles, takes the throne. He is known as Charles the Great, or in French, Charlemagne. It is Charlemagne who will succeed in defeating the Lombards, and he will become their king as well, and would actually later marry a Lombard to kind of solidify that unity. There were a lot of ties to the church in the line of Charlemagne. There had been many bishops in the family ancestry, and so there was a good connection there to the church. But when we get to the later Middle Ages, we'll see that, because Charlemagne is kind of our ruler here, where we're kind of taking the break. As we'll see in the second half here, and the early part of the later Middle Ages, that Charlemagne tries to take on more authority. As he is crowned emperor in the year 800, he'll try to take on more authority, which will lead to some tension with the papacy. One particular enemy for Charlemagne, after the Lombards are defeated, were the Saxons. The Saxons come from a region that is now in northwest Germany. Fought the Saxons at various times for over 33 years, but was also interested in converting them as well. As he does gain some control over some Saxons, he demands that all Saxons be baptized, which many of them, of course, refuse to do. According to records, upwards of 4,000 Saxons were killed in one day for their refusal to be baptized. Not surprisingly, shortly after that, the Saxons surrender and decide to be baptized. It later becomes a requirement that all infants under 1 year old had to be baptized in the church, or their parents faced execution if they attempted to hide their children from baptism. Eventually, it was decided that Charlemagne would be crowned the first Roman emperor in several hundred years. And the last one was 476. And when Charlemagne is crowned in 800, there had not been a Roman emperor.